Emma Carter made the graduation with 8 minutes to spare, still in her scrubs. A scaffolding collapse had come in at 10 o'clock before 5 o'clock that morning. 9 casualties. She didn't leave until the last one was stable, and by then, there was no time to change. Wexford Military Institute was not the kind of place that forgave hospital scrubs. Vivian Ashcroft saw her from across the marble hall and said it loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Some people have no respect for an occasion like this." Nobody said anything. The administrator asked her, politely, whether she'd be more comfortable waiting outside until the ceremony ended. Emma didn't argue. She reached down for her bag, and her sleeves slid back. Colonel Ethan Vaughn was 10 feet away. He saw the steel bracelet on her wrist, a name, a rank, and a date engraved across it, and he stopped walking like the floor had gone out from under him, because he knew that name, and he was the reason it was on her wrist. Before we start, if you've ever kept a promise nobody knew you made, drop Never Judge in the comments, and hit subscribe. The scaffolding came down at 10 minutes to 5 o'clock in the morning. It was a 6-story residential build on the east side of the city, and the collapse took 2 levels of decking with it, and the first ambulance was at the doors of Emma Carter's emergency department by 5:20 with 3 men in the back and 6 more still coming. She had been on shift since midnight. She worked the first one, then the second, then the fourth and the 7th, moving between bays with the unhurried economy of someone who had learned a long time ago that speed and panic are 2 different things, and only one of them is useful. The last patient stabilized at 7:11, a 26-year-old with a crushed forearm and a pressure reading that took 40 minutes to bring back where she wanted it. She could have handed him off at 6 o'clock. She didn't hand him off. She stayed until his numbers held their own because leaving before that was not something her hands knew how to do. And then she walked out through the ambulance bay into the morning light and got into her car and drove for 40 minutes with a dress hanging in a bag on the hook behind her seat that she had picked up from the cleaners 4 days earlier and was not going to get the chance to put on. Wexford Military Institute sat on 900 acres of Virginia Hill country behind a stone gate that had been there since 1874. It was the kind of place that produced senators and generals and the sons of senators and generals, where tuition ran past $70,000 a year before you counted the uniform allowance, and where the commissioning ceremony every May drew families who arrived in cars that cost more than most of the houses in the county below. The main hall had marble floors and 40-foot windows and a portrait gallery of men in dress uniform going back a century and a half. On the morning of a commissioning it filled with pressed linen and expensive perfume, and the low steady hum of people who had been attending occasions like this one for long enough that they had stopped being impressed by them. Emma pushed through the doors at 7:52 with 8 minutes to spare, still in her scrubs, hospital badge clipped to her left chest, hair loose from a night that had never once given her a moment to fix it. She was aware of how she looked. She had been aware of it since the parking lot, in the way you become aware of a thing you cannot change and have decided not to spend energy on. What she did not do was slow down or apologize with her posture or make herself smaller on the way through the room, because awareness and shame are not the same thing, and she had never once confused them. She did not head for the family section. She headed for the back wall, past the seating, past the ushers with their programs, to a spot near the rear doors where she could see the field through the tall windows, and where nobody would have any reason to look at her twice. That was where she wanted to be. She had thought about it on the drive, and she had thought about it for 3 weeks before that. Standing at the back was the whole of what she had come to do. While she stood there waiting for the doors to the parade ground to open, her right hand found her left wrist and stayed there, thumb moving slowly across a band of steel under her sleeve, and she did not appear to notice she was doing it. In her bag was an envelope that had arrived 3 weeks earlier, postmarked Dayton, Ohio, addressed in handwriting that slanted hard to the right, and pressed deep enough into the paper to be readable from the back of the page. She had read it more times than she was willing to count, and she had not answered it. Not because she didn't know what to say, but because she had not been certain until she was actually in the car that she would be able to make herself come. The letter was 4 paragraphs long. The last one was 2 sentences. She could have recited both of them from memory, and had once, out loud, alone in her kitchen at 3 o'clock in the morning. Down in the family section, in the third row on the aisle where the ushers had reserved it, there was one seat with a small printed card on it that nobody had claimed. And as the hall filled and the rows tightened, and people shuffled past each other with programs held above their heads, that one seat stayed exactly as empty as it had been when the doors opened. Vivian Ashcroft noticed Emma at 4 minutes past 8 o'clock. She was 56 years old in a cream jacket that had been fitted to her twice, standing with a small group near the center aisle in the loose configuration of people who know everyone in the room and are performing that fact gently for each other's benefit. Her son Preston was graduating today, third generation Wexford, and she had been looking forward to this morning for 11 months. She looked at Emma across 20 feet of marble, at the wrinkled scrubs, the badge, the sneakers, the hair, with an expression that did not bother to conceal itself. Then she said it. Not to her husband, not under her breath, but in a clear, carrying voice pitched to reach the 6 or 7 people standing nearest to her. Which it did. And several more beyond them. Which it also did. She said that it was remarkable what people considered acceptable now. She said that this was a commissioning ceremony at a military institution. That there were young men and women out on that field who had spent 4 years earning what was about to happen to them. And that some people apparently had no respect for an occasion like this one. Preston, standing beside her in his dress uniform with his cover under his arm, smirked at the floor. A woman 2 feet away found something to examine on her phone. A man in a blazer took one small step sideways. The size of step a person takes when they want the arrangement of the group to make clear they are not part of the conversation. Without having to say so. Nobody said anything to Vivian Ashcroft. Nobody said anything to Emma either. Emma looked out the tall windows at the parade ground. And kept her hand where it was. And did not turn around. Mr. Denton arrived 90 seconds later with the apologetic efficiency of a man doing something unpleasant. And hoping the packaging will carry it. He was in his 40s. An assistant director of institutional advancement. And he had been sent. Though he did not say by whom. He explained that they'd had a query about seating. He mentioned the dress code in a tone that suggested he personally found it a little silly. He wondered whether he waited for a name. And she did not supply one. Whether she might be more comfortable waiting in the visitors' lounge. Where there was coffee. And where the ceremony would be shown on a monitor. And where she could rejoin everyone afterward for the reception. He said all of it with a practiced smile, and eyes that had made their decision before he opened his mouth. Emma did not argue. She had spent a great deal of her life around people who had already decided something, and she knew exactly how much energy it was worth spending on them. She simply bent down to pick up the bag at her feet, and as she reached, the loose sleeve of her scrub top slid back along her forearm, and exposed her left wrist to the room for perhaps 2 full seconds. A steel cuff, brushed and unpolished, worn dull at the edges from 4 years of being taken off only to shower. A name engraved across it, a rank, a date. Colonel Ethan Vaughan was 10 feet away with his cover under his arm, 6 minutes out from presiding over his 9th Wexford commissioning, and he stopped walking so completely that the aide behind him nearly walked into his back. He was looking at her wrist, and then, in a voice that did not sound like it belonged to a man who had spoken in front of 2,000 people the week before, he said a name out loud that nobody in that marble hall had any reason to recognize. Owen Pike. The hall did not go quiet all at once. It went quiet in pieces. The group nearest Vivian Ashcroft first, then the rows behind them, then the ushers by the doors. The way a room empties of sound when people register that something has happened without yet understanding what. Emma straightened up slowly with her bag in her hand. She looked at the man who had said the name, at the dress blues and the eagles on his collar, and the face of someone who had just been struck by something invisible, and she understood in that moment that whatever happened in the next several minutes was not going to be within her control. Denton was still standing beside her with his practiced smile frozen halfway through its arc. Emma gave the colonel the only answer she had that belonged to her. I was his corpsman. Vaughan asked her to walk with him, not as an order and not quite as a request. The way a man asks when he has understood that the conversation he needs to have cannot happen in front of 200 people holding programs. They went through a side door into a corridor lined with class photographs going back to the 30s, and Denton did not follow. And the aide stayed at the door. When they stopped walking, Vaughn did not ask what she was doing at Wexford, or how she had come by the bracelet, or any of the questions Emma had braced for on the walk down the hallway. He asked her whether she had been the one who stayed with him. That was the question. Not, "Were you there?" Whether she had been the one who stayed. Owen Pike had been 23 years old, a sergeant in a Marine infantry battalion from Dayton, Ohio, with a mother named Denise and a younger sister named Maya, who he talked about the way some men talk about a car they're rebuilding. Constantly, in detail, to anyone within range. Emma had been the corpsman attached to his platoon for 14 months. The Marines called her Doc, which is what Marines call corpsmen. And after the first few months, they stopped thinking of her as Navy at all. Owen used to save the good coffee for her. He was the one who noticed when she hadn't eaten. He had a running argument with her about whether Ohio State had ever produced a quarterback worth the name, which he lost every time and restarted the following week. And he had a photograph in his kit of a 15-year-old girl in a soccer uniform holding a trophy nearly as tall as she was. It happened in a village with one road in and the same road out, and the road was not usable that afternoon. Owen took shrapnel low through the abdomen from a device that went off 11 from him. Emma reached him in under 30 seconds. What she found was survivable. She has never once, in 4 years, allowed herself the comfort of thinking otherwise. Provided he was on an operating table inside 2 hours, she packed the wound and started fluids and got the bleeding under control with her hands and her knees and everything in her kit, and she called for the medevac at 14 minutes past 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The bird was diverted at 3:40 to a casualty assessed as higher priority. It was diverted again at 4:55. Emma kept working. She kept Owen conscious for the first 3 hours, and she talked to him the whole time, and he talked back for most of it. About Maya, about a scholarship application she'd sent off in the spring, about what he was going to say to her when she got into somewhere good. Emma told him he was going to tell Maya himself. He said he knew that. Then he asked her, sometime in the 5th hour, when his voice had gone thin, and the light was starting to leave the sky, whether she'd go if he couldn't. "Just stand at the back," he said. "Just so somebody's there." Emma told him yes, because you tell a man yes, and then she kept him alive for another hour and 11 minutes after that. He died at 9:22 in the evening. The helicopter came in at 10:02. The review was thorough, and it cleared her entirely. It found that her field management was exemplary, that the casualty was survivable at the point of injury, and that the delay in evacuation was the determining factor and had originated well above her level. They recommended her for a commendation. Emma read the finding twice and put it in a drawer. She left the Navy 8 months later. And it was not guilt, exactly. She believed the review most days. It was that she could not stop doing the arithmetic. 2 hours to a table. 6 hours and 8 minutes on that ground. 40 minutes between the last breath and the rotors. Somewhere in those 8 months, she walked into a shop in a strip mall outside the base, and had a steel cuff made with his name and his rank and the date on the outside. And on the inside, on the surface that sits against the skin where nobody would ever see it. 2 words that meant nothing to anyone but her. 6 hours. If you have ever carried something for years that you never once explained to anybody, drop "never judge" in the comments right now. Because the woman standing in that hallway had never said any of this out loud to a single living person before that morning. Then she told Vaughn the part that undid the assumption every person in that hall had made about her. Maya Pike was not her sister. Emma had never met her. She had never met Denise Pike either, though they had written to each other 4 times over 4 years. And 3 weeks ago a letter had arrived in handwriting that pressed hard into the paper saying that the doctors had told her she couldn't fly. That Maya would be commissioning with no one in the family section. And that she was asking, she was sorry to ask, whether Emma might go and stand somewhere in that building so that somebody from Owen's world would be under the same roof. Emma had not written back. She had gotten in the car at 7-Eleven that morning with blood on her sleeve and driven 40 minutes, and come in through those doors with 8 minutes to spare. And she had gone straight to the back wall. Because standing at the back was the entire promise. And she had never intended to be seen doing it. Denton found them in the corridor 2 minutes later. Whatever had happened in the marble hall after they left had clearly reached him because the practiced smile was gone. And what had replaced it was a man visibly recalculating a decision he had made 11 minutes earlier. He apologized. He apologized again. Worse the second time. He said that there was seating available in the front row of the family section. That he would take her personally. That it would be no trouble at all. Emma thanked him and told him no. She said there was a seat reserved in the third row on the aisle for Denise Pike and that it was going to stay empty. And that she was not going to sit in it or in front of it. Because the woman that seat belonged to had wanted to be here more than anyone in that building and could not come. She said she'd be at the back wall where she had planned to be since 3 weeks ago. Denton opened his mouth, closed it, and said, "Of course." Vaughn had not said anything for a while. He was standing with his cover under his arm and his eyes somewhere on the floor between them, and when Emma finally looked at him properly, she saw that his jaw had set in a way that had nothing to do with ceremony or protocol. He asked her quietly whether she remembered the time the bird was first diverted. Emma said 3:40. Vaughn nodded slowly once, like a man confirming something he had already known for 4 years and had been hoping right up until that second that he was wrong about. He told her plainly because there was no version of it that got easier by being arranged carefully. For years ago, he had been a lieutenant colonel in an operation cell 600 miles from that village, sitting in a room with a screen and a radio and 3 competing casualty reports, and he had been the approving authority on the air tasking that afternoon. He had made the call at 3:40. He had made it again at 4:55. Both times the assessment in front of him said the same thing, that the sergeant with the abdominal wound had a corpseman on the ground holding him, and the other casualties did not. And both times he had done what the assessment told him to do, which was to send the bird to the ones with nobody. He had signed his name to both diversions. He had read the after-action report 6 weeks later and learned that Owen Pike had died at 9:22 in the evening, and that the aircraft had touched down at 10:02, and he had carried that 40 minutes around with him every day since, the same way she carried 6 hours around on her wrist. Emma did not say anything for a moment. She had spent 4 years doing arithmetic on a decision that was never hers, and she had spent all of it without ever once having a face to attach to it. And now the face was standing 3 feet away in dress blues about to preside over a commissioning ceremony. What she felt was not what she would have predicted. She told him the assessment had been correct. She said it flatly, the way she said clinical things, because it was true. The casualty with a corpseman on the ground was the one you leave. That is exactly what the priority system exists to do. And she would have made the same call from that room with that information in front of her. Vaughn said he knew that. He said knowing it had never once been the problem. And the two of them stood in a corridor full of class photographs from the 1930s on opposite ends of the same night with 4 minutes until the doors opened. The ceremony began at 8:30. Wexford did it the way Wexford did everything, with an order of events that had not meaningfully changed since the Eisenhower administration, and a parade ground that looked like an oil painting when the light came across it in the morning. The formation marched on. The colors were posted. Emma stood at the back wall by the rear doors with her bag at her feet and watched through the tall windows and did not move for 40 minutes, and nobody came to move her either. Vivian Ashcroft sat in the 5th row and turned around exactly twice. Maya Pike commissioned 22 minutes into the ceremony. She was 22 years old, small, dark-haired, and she had her brother's jaw and her brother's way of squaring up before she moved, which Emma noticed from 40 yards away and had to look at the floor for a second afterward. When her name was read, the announcer added the line that goes with it. Recipient of the Owen Pike Memorial Scholarship. Because Wexford reads the endowed awards aloud, and Emma had not known until that second that the scholarship existed or that it carried his name, or that it was the reason a girl from Dayton was standing on a parade ground in Virginia. Denise Pike had never mentioned it in 4 letters. And when Maya's name was read, the 3rd row on the aisle stayed empty. And nobody in the family section stood. And the applause was the ordinary applause a room gives every name on the list. Emma stood at the back wall and clapped, and did not take her eyes off the girl. The reception was in the same marble hall at 10:15. 400 people with champagne flutes and small plates. The specific warm chaos of families who have been holding something in for 4 years and are finally allowed to put it down. Emma had every intention of leaving. She had the promise done. She had stood at the back. Somebody from Owen's world had been under the roof. And she had a shift starting at 8 o'clock that night. And 40 minutes of driving between her, and 4 hours of sleep. She was 30 feet from the doors when a woman screamed on the other side of the hall. Preston Ashcroft had gone down between 2 catering tables with a plate still in his hand. He was 22. And he had eaten 1 bite of something with crab in it, which he had been carefully avoiding at every meal since he was 6. And by the time his mother reached him, his lips had gone gray. And there was a sound coming out of him that was not breathing so much as the attempt at it. Vivian Ashcroft was on the floor beside her son screaming for a doctor into a room of 400 people. Most of whom had turned to look and none of whom had moved. Emma was already moving. She crossed that hall at a fast walk with her bag off her shoulder, and opened before she was halfway. And she went down onto her knees on the marble beside him. And did 4 things in about 11 seconds. She got his jaw forward and his airway open. She put 2 fingers on his carotid and read it. She looked at the hives coming up his neck. And the color, and the effort. And said the word anaphylaxis out loud once. Flatly. To nobody in particular. So that anyone with a functioning brain in that room would know what they were looking at. And she pulled an EpiPen out of her bag because she carried one. She had carried one for years. She was the kind of person who carried one, and put it into his outer thigh through the dress trousers and held it there and counted. Then she started giving orders in the specific clipped register that leaves no room in it for hesitation. She told the man nearest her to call 911 and give the address of the building and the words anaphylaxis. AP administered. She told the caterer to bring her the plate Preston had been holding and not to let anyone touch anything on that table. She told a young man in dress blues to go stand at the main doors and wave the ambulance in. She told Vivian Ashcroft to hold her son's hand and keep talking to him because it would help him and because it would give her something to do with her hands. And then she stayed on that floor with her fingers on his pulse and her eyes on his chest, and she watched the gray leave his face by degrees, and she talked to him the whole time in a voice so level that 2 people standing nearby said afterward they had forgotten to be frightened themselves. The paramedics came through the doors 9 minutes later and Emma gave them the handoff in about 20 seconds. Time of onset, allergen, dose, time of administration, vitals at 2-minute intervals, the plate bagged and sitting beside her on the marble. The lead paramedic wrote it down, and then looked up at her for a second longer than the report required. Preston was talking by the time they got him onto the stretcher. Vivian Ashcroft went with him as far as the doors and then stopped because she had realized halfway there that she had not said anything at all to the woman on the floor, and she turned around in the middle of a hall full of 400 people, and looked back. Emma was still on her knees on the marble peeling off a pair of ruined gloves. Her scrubs worse than they had been when she walked in that morning. She sat back on her heels and let herself breathe for the first time in 9 minutes. And when she looked up, she found that the entire room was already silent and turned toward her. And Colonel Ethan Vaughn was walking toward the microphone at the front of the hall. Vaughn did not do it the way people expect these things to be done. He did not call for attention or tap the microphone or ask the room to quiet down. Because the room had already gone quiet on its own and had been that way since the paramedics came through the doors. He stood at the microphone with his cover in his hand and he started by describing a morning, a scaffolding collapse at 10 minutes to 5. 9 casualties. A nurse who had already been on shift for 5 hours when the first ambulance arrived and who did not leave until the last patient held his own numbers without help. Which happened at 7:11. Which left her 40 minutes of driving and no time at all to change out of the clothes she had been working in. He said she made it through the doors of that building with 8 minutes to spare. He said that when she arrived, she was told there had been a complaint about how she was dressed, and asked whether she might wait in another room until the ceremony was over. He let that sit for a second. Then he told them what was on her wrist. A steel bracelet with a name, a rank, and a date on it. Sergeant Owen Pike, United States Marine Corps. And he said that he had recognized it from 10 feet away because he had known that name for 4 years and had never once expected to see it on a civilian's arm in a room like this one. He said that in a village with 1 road in and out, that woman had kept Sergeant Pike alive on the ground for 6 hours and 8 minutes. Waiting on an evacuation that did not come. and that the evacuation did not come because of a decision made in an operation cell 600 miles away. By a man who was standing at this microphone right now. He said it plainly, and he did not soften it. And he did not look away from the room while he said it. Then he told them why she had come. He said that somewhere in the 5th hour on that ground, Sergeant Pike had asked her to go to his sister's graduation if he could not, and to stand at the back so somebody would be there. He said the woman on the floor of this hall 9 minutes ago had driven 40 minutes in blood-stained scrubs to keep that promise. That she had gone to the back wall on purpose, and stayed there for the entire ceremony. And that she had turned down a seat in the front row because the seat reserved in the 3rd row belonged to Denise Pike, who could not travel. And who had asked her 3 weeks ago in a letter to come and stand somewhere in this building. He said that the young woman who commissioned 22 minutes into the ceremony this morning on the Owen Pike Memorial Scholarship had no idea any of this was true. Maya Pike was standing near the back of the room in her dress uniform with a plate she had forgotten she was holding. Vaughn asked her to come forward. Then he asked Emma to come forward, too. And then he said the thing that took the room apart. That at Wexford the bars are pinned by family. That this had been the tradition since 1874. And that in his judgment as the presiding officer, there was not a person in that hall with a stronger claim to that word than the woman who had spent 6 hours holding Owen Pike's brother-in-arms promised together with her hands. Emma walked up through 400 people in her ruined scrubs. Maya stood in front of her at attention, and then stopped being at attention because she was 22, and she had heard about a corpsman named Doc in 4 years of her mother's phone calls without ever once being told a full name, and she had spent that morning commissioning in front of an empty seat. Emma pinned her bars with hands that were completely steady. The same hands that had been steady on a marble floor 11 minutes earlier, and on a road in a village 4 years before that. Maya reached up and put her fingers around Emma's left wrist over with steel, and held on. Emma told her that her brother had talked about her constantly, and that everyone in that platoon had known who she was long before they knew anything else about him. Maya asked whether he had known about the scholarship. Emma said no, and that he had known she was going to get in somewhere good and had said so out loud on that road in the 5th hour. Vaughn found her afterward at the edge of the hall near the doors once the crowd had turned back into a crowd. He did not stand in front of her. He stood beside her looking out at the room in the way of a man who has learned that some things are easier to say sideways. He apologized. Not the institutional version. He said he had made 2 calls with an assessment in front of him, and that he would probably make them again, and that being right had never once been the thing that helped. Emma told him she knew because she had been doing the same arithmetic from the other end of it. Then he told her the part that was not an apology. Owen Pike's Silver Star packet had been drafted 4 years ago, and had stalled because the after-action was sealed behind a control number, and the only witness to the last 6 hours had separated from the Navy, and could not be located by anyone who went looking through official channels. He said he was reopening it Monday. He said her account was the missing piece, and he asked whether she would write it. Emma said yes. Then Vaughn asked her for the second thing which he had been thinking about since the corridor. Wexford brought in 500 cadets a year, he said, and taught them a great deal about leadership and almost nothing about what it costs. He wanted 1 hour once a year in front of the incoming class. Not a lecture on tactics. An hour on what it actually looks like when the system does exactly what it is supposed to do and a man dies anyway. Told by the person who was on the ground for it. Emma looked out at the hall for a while before she answered. Then she said she'd do it, and that she wanted Denise Pike invited to the first one, and Vaughn said that had already occurred to him. Vivian Ashcroft was waiting near the doors. She had come back from the ambulance, and she had been standing there for some time working out how to do something she had very little practice at. What she said was short. She said that her son was breathing because of a woman she had humiliated in front of 40 people 90 minutes earlier. That she had been wrong in a way she was not going to be able to explain away to herself, and that she was sorry. She did not ask to be forgiven, and she did not attempt to soften it with anything. Emma told her to make sure Preston carried 2 pens from now on, and kept 1 in the car. Then she picked up her bag. The Silver Star came through 11 months later. Denise Pike accepted it in a small ceremony in Dayton with an oxygen line under her nose and her daughter in dress blues beside her. And Emma sat in the second row because she had refused the first one again. She gave the first hour at Wexford that September to 490 cadets who did not make a single sound for the whole of it. And she has given it every year since. Always in September. Always in the same room. She still works nights. She never changed the bracelet. Maya Pike came through the doors of Emma's emergency department 7 months after that on a Tuesday afternoon in uniform on her way to her first duty station. She had driven 90 minutes out of her way to do it. She waited by the desk until Emma came out of a bay and she held out her arm without saying anything first. And on her wrist was a steel cuff brushed and unpolished with her brother's name and rank and the date engraved across the front of it. She had it made in a shop off base, she said. She had not known what to put on the inside. She asked Emma what hers said. Emma turned her own wrist over and showed her the 2 words that had been sitting against her skin for 4 years. And Maya read them and did not say anything for a while. And then she asked the question that everyone eventually asks, whether it ever stopped. Emma told her the truth, which was no, and that it was not supposed to, and that carrying it was not the same as being crushed by it. Then a call came in and she had to go. And she said the last thing over her shoulder on the way to the doors, the same thing she had said to Vaughn in the corridor, and to Maya on the parade ground, and to herself at 3 o'clock in the morning for 4 years. I didn't save him. I just stayed.